Hello everyone, and welcome. We are all waiting on the new Zelda Breath of the Wild 2 to release. A lot of us are wanting any new piece of official information or leak we can get. Usually, during our Zelda and Nintendo podcast, the Highland Gamescast, we will mention details from an interview, an official announcement, or even in the situation where details were leaked directly from the Spanish voice actor of Daruk. So I decided to research and gather everything that I could in a single video. Obviously, not everyone can know every single little detail, and I'm sure there may still be a few that I left out. If you know of any official details, news, or anything that we leave out, please comment it below, and when Nintendo releases more information, we will add what you said to that video and credit you with a shout out while reading it. We will begin with a nice roundup of interviews and announcements compiled by Video Game Chronicle, then go more in depth with everything else organized by the specific topic, such as dungeon, story, Zelda, multiplayer, DLC, and so on. Nintendo has shared behind-the-scenes images of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild 2's reveal trailer. The images, posted on its Japanese recruitment site, show the various steps of the trailer's creation, from concept to motion capture to the Maya animation tool. Zelda producer 𝗷𝗵𝗲 confirmed in June that Breath of the Wild director Fujibayashi has retained the role on the sequel. In an interview with Game Informer, 𝗷𝗵𝗲 said, "We're working together really hard on this game. One of the reasons we wanted to create a continuation was because I wanted to revisit and use that world again, while incorporating new gameplay and new story. I really like the idea of having DLC or anything after the main game. People play the game longer and enjoy the game a lot deeper going forward. That's definitely something we'll think about." 𝗷𝗵𝗲 also said that younger members of the sequel's development team had drawn inspiration from Red Dead Redemption 2, while Fujibayashi was playing Skyrim during the creation of the original Breath of the Wild. They didn't include it here, but 𝗷𝗵𝗲 himself said that during Breath of the Wild 1's development, he was also heavily inspired by Skyrim. When we released the DLC for Breath of the Wild, we realized that this is a great way to add more elements to the same world, 𝗷𝗵𝗲 told Kotaku. But when it comes down to technical things, DLC is pretty much data. You're adding data to a pre-existing title, and so when we wanted to add bigger changes, DLC is not enough. And that's why we thought maybe a sequel would be a good fit. Initially, we were thinking of just DLC ideas, but then we had a lot of ideas and we said, this is too many ideas. Let's just make one new game and start from scratch. Though, obviously, it's a sequel reusing the same overworld character models with some changes, same engine. So it's not really from scratch, but you get the idea. A trailer shown during its Nintendo Direct E3 presentation featured Link and Zelda together, although no further details were announced. Elsewhere, 𝗷𝗵𝗲 wouldn't answer on whether or not Zelda might be a playable character, or if the title will support co-op. "It's kind of interesting that you bring that up," he told IGN, "because in Breath of the Wild, you see Zelda and Link together often too. So to go straight into the thought of co-op is very interesting to me." He also told Kotaku he can't say how many playable characters the game will feature. Now we get into the specific topics. These will all be from various interviews or announcements from IGN, Kotaku, Game Informer, and other places. I'll try to have all of these sources in the description below, with as much as possible shown on screen. In an interview with Kotaku on dungeons and innovations for the future of Zelda, Kotaku said, "When we talked in 2014, you told me you wanted to reconstruct the idea of puzzles entirely. What do you want your next big innovation to be?" Referencing an interview about the original Breath of the Wild, 𝗷𝗵𝗲 laughs and simply says, "I can't tell you. I mean, from a big picture perspective, similar to the idea of reconstructing puzzles in a Zelda game. That's a good challenge. What's the next big challenge for you?" he again asked. 𝗷𝗵𝗲 replied, "One thing we learned from Breath of the Wild is that when we focused on creating a dungeon that has multiple solutions, it turned into this great title. That's one thing I want to polish up and use for inspiration going forward. I thought Breath of the Wild was a masterpiece. A lot of people did. But is there anything you wish you could have done better?" 𝗷𝗵𝗲 replies, "I can't really speak to that too specifically. I might use the ideas I have for a next Zelda game, or whatever Zelda series I might be working on in the future." IGN got a similar answer when asking, "One more about this, and then we can talk about Link's Awakening. I was curious. Zelda and Link seem to be in a big underground cavern. Are we going to see something different with dungeons this time around?" 𝗷𝗵𝗲, "Unfortunately, I can't really speak too much about it right now. leading to the topic of DLC. But first, petting dogs. In another interview with IGN, director 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 that such a specific action wouldn't fit in with the game's philosophy, wherein every action had many purposes. So if it came down to something like petting a dog, we would actually have to put in a custom action just for petting a dog. That couldn't really be used for anything else. In the game, standing and staring at a dog will elicit a pink cloud of love. They may just lead you to hidden items too, but we want to be rewarded for our good work with pets. After 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 heard of this, there is hope that in the next game, Link will pet a dog or two. 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 added, even in situations like this, talking to people and finding out that people want to pet dogs gives me a lot of motivation, a lot of ideas for things we could put into the game. When IGN asked 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 about DLC for the sequel, and even brought up petting dogs again, 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 said, I can't say at this point if it will be in sequels or in continuations, or what form it will take, but I definitely have a lot of ideas and lots of motivations right now. I think while we were working on both the main game and the DLC, it was a process of constantly getting lots of different new ideas as we refined the game and finding new things we wanted to do. Even in situations like this, talking to people and finding out that people want to pet dogs gives me a lot of motivation, a lot of ideas for things we could put into the game. What we learned from the DLC this time around is that it's almost like raising the world or enhancing the world. 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 then said, in the past, we always had to start from zero again to completion. Usually we'd be thinking, oh, I wish we could add this, we could do that. What we couldn't do in that game, we could start fresh in a new game. But because we did a DLC, we realized it's a great way to kind of just improve that world and kind of enhance it and raise it up like your own child. I'm sure almost everyone is aware of one of the very first things that was actually revealed about Breath of the Wild 2 when they showed the trailer off at E3, with certain people at Nintendo comparing it to Majora's Mask and saying it will be the darkest Zelda game. 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 says, like the tale of the Skull Kid, this looks dark, odd, melancholy. The trailer's haunting, reverse-voiced soundtrack, subterranean locations, murdered rats, and reanimated mummified remains lend a much grimmer tone that you might expect of a follow-up to Nintendo's pastel color masterpiece, obviously referring to Majora's Mask. Going into that, IGN stated, you surprised everybody with a big trailer in the Direct, and we're all excited about that. I just played Link's Awakening, and I want to talk to you a lot about that, but I have to ask about the trailer. Everybody's buzzing with excitement. It seemed like this was a dark twist on Breath of the Wild that reminded me of Majora's Mask. Was that on purpose? 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 says, the new Breath of the Wild, or the sequel to it, it's not necessarily going to be related to Majora's Mask or inspired by it. It's just that it happened to be what we showed you currently is a little bit darker, and we're honestly still in production, so we can't really say exactly how it's going to be turning out. 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 confirmed that while the sequel of Breath of the Wild has a darker tone, it's not going to be related to Majora's Mask. That it's just going to give off that darker tone, while being a direct sequel. On the comparison to Majora's Mask, Bill Trinen had a lot to say to IGN, and the title of the game. I would say it's an easy comparison or conclusion to jump to at this point in time, just given what's been shown so far and given the nature of it being a direct sequel. So I understand people making that conclusion, but at the same time, I don't want to delve too much into it. But this is its own game. I think as we start to show a bit more of the game over the coming months, to the next year or so, it'll probably start to be a bit more apparent where this game stands on its own, and what makes it so unique. The way that this sequel builds on Breath of the Wild, which already was such an expansive game with so many layers of Link's abilities and layers to the gameplay. I think this is going to layer quite a bit more into that. By the time you finish playing it, I think everybody is probably going to come to the conclusion that this is really its own thing. As for why we're holding back on the name, you'll just have to stay tuned because, obviously, Zelda names are kind of important. Those subtitles, they start to give little bits of hints about maybe what's going to happen. Breath of the Wild 2 is going to be shorthand, and it's natural for people to want to find a shorthand way to frame it. We're still calling it the sequel to Breath of the Wild. In interviews where multiplayer, co-op, and even playing as Zelda were brought up, 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 seemed to love the idea, stating, I would like to take what I learned from Breath of the Wild and see if we can somehow fuse those learning points into another multiplayer Zelda. For example, with Triforce Heroes, which followed a similar format of 4 swords. There was a multiplayer involved in that game. That's definitely a possibility, and we will continue to experiment throughout the Zelda franchise. And yes, it may seem like he may have been hinting towards Age of Calamity with this, but in interviews he very specifically states the Breath of the Wild engine and a Zelda-style game, which Age of Calamity isn't. Nor does it have online multiplayer, as he said he would like to do with what he learned from Triforce Heroes. And when developing the 2 Hyrule Warriors games, Aonuma specifically told the development team to do their best to not make the gameplay similar to Zelda, which is why they don't have dungeons, real puzzles, and things like that. And basically told them not to have the word Zelda in the title. So, Hyrule Warriors. In other interviews, he said the 2-player functionality of Hyrule Warriors is actually something that has traditionally been done in the Dynasty Warriors series, but they've changed because of the hardware and the second screen on your gamepad. Instead of having a split screen on the television, you have 1 player playing on the television and 1 on the gamepad. When I was talking back about making Zelda more than just a single player experience, that's something you will see in the future, maybe next year. At this point, he was talking about making Breath of the Wild, or Zelda Wii U at the time, multiplayer, with 1 person playing on screen and the other playing on the gamepad. Obviously, that didn't happen, but Nintendo always reuses ideas that were removed or didn't make it into the previous game for their next game. I know for a long time people have wanted to play as Zelda, and there have been some games where you get to play as Zelda, a little bit. It looked like Zelda and Link were hanging out a lot together. Do you think this is going to be the game in which we get to play as Zelda, maybe as a co-op game? Aonuma replied, "It's kind of interesting that you bring that up, because in Breath of the Wild, you see Zelda and Link together often too. So to go straight into the thought of co-op is very interesting to me." When Miyamoto was asked a similar question about Zelda, Linkle, or a female being playable, he replied, wanting to keep the existing vision for the character of Link intact. Miyamoto instead revealed that an entirely new game dedicated to an existing Zelda heroine could be a better option for those wanting to see a female protagonist take up the leading role. In fact, it's something that the development team has already discussed. And if you remember, Skyward Sword's ending was actually supposed to be you playing as Princess Zelda on her side of the quest, opposite of what Link had gone on throughout the game, with you side by side, presumably with 𝗵𝗲, running away, defending yourself, and fighting against Zant. But sadly it was removed, although I'm pretty sure they did say it was finished. On Zelda being playable, his exact quote was, "Within the development team, too, there have been talks about how it might be cool to have a game that features Sheik as a protagonist. It's having maybe a Zelda spin-off with Sheik as a protagonist, for example. I don't think that's an impossibility." And obviously it's not an impossibility because they've already said that is something that they intended to do and still want to do. Obviously, we can't forget the infamous voice actor leak, where the Spanish voice of Daruk said not only is he returning to the game to voice Daruk in the sequel, but also playing one of Daruk's Goron ancestors, presumably the original Goron champion that imprisoned Calamity Ganon and piloted Vah Rudonia, which implies that we're going to be getting a flashback, or at the very least a cutscene showing what happened back then, maybe in the form of a memory. One interviewer asked, talking about the team that's working on this game, I just read an interview where Mr. Miyamoto told people he doesn't want to hire super passionate game fans anymore, but instead, people that have different interests and skill sets. I was wondering, what qualities do you look for in people to make them part of the Zelda team? How do you get onto the Zelda team? What makes those people interesting? Aonuma replied, I'm thinking probably very similar to Mr. Miyamoto, and not necessarily do I want to work with someone that's good at playing games. I would rather be with people that maybe have an interest in climbing mountains or love scuba diving in the ocean. Just someone with a very different skill, and so maybe by having those skills, we can incorporate them into our games. And we obviously have Nintendo announcing Monolith Soft has finally formed their own official Zelda production team after they finished their work on Breath of the Wild and its Champion Ballad DLC. Whether or not their team was made official to begin their own new Zelda project, or if they will continue working alongside Nintendo on the new Breath of the Wild, we don't know. However, we do know that even after that announcement was made, both Nintendo and that same Monolith Soft Zelda team had massive hirings for people to join their teams to work on the Zelda series. When Breath of the Wild 2 was delayed from 2022 until spring 2023, Aonuma stated, "We have decided to extend our development time a bit and change the release to spring 2023. For those of you who have been looking forward to a release this year, we apologize. In order to make this game's experience something special, the entire development team is continuing to work diligently on this game, so please wait a while longer." A huge thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. If you're a fan of the channel, you can help support us on Patreon, where you can get a lot of great rewards. Have your questions featured on videos or the podcasts, have your topic, theory, news, or anything else discussed as a topic on the podcast. Sometimes join on the podcasts with us, be featured in a video, sometimes even watch videos early, and much more. I really need to say thank you, honestly beyond thank you, to the most generous Patreon supporter that I have, Shadow to Us. Thank you so much for everything. And thank you to everyone else on here as well. Justin Clark, Monica Spath, SOBERX, Endramoy, Joseph Stewart, Natsu, Wrecker1, Rusty Caulfield, Tremel Shefford, Ashton Wren, Blargnar, Chad Costin, David Guthman, Disappointment, Gus Calvo, Gene Pinna, Candy, Livable Christie, Mr. Monocled Metroid, only donated to hear Jesse speak my name, and ZAIN. Thank you all so much. Sadly, I've still been having some internet issues, but thanks to all of you on Patreon, hopefully everything will be fixed soon.